The alarm on the docking ring screamed before the transport door even opened, and every student in the boarding hall dropped low except one. I remember that moment better than I remember my own hatching day. My name is Zethka, and I was standing in the boarding hall of Vale Orbital Academy when the proximity alarm went off, warning us that an unregistered mass had entered the docking clamp too fast. Metal groaned. Sparks fell from a loose panel above the gate. Every student around me folded down, wings tucked, claws braced, the way our instincts taught us before we could even walk. The transport door opened anyway. A girl stepped out, humming. She had a bag slung over one shoulder, covered in small, colorful stickers of animals I did not recognize. Her hair was tied back in a loose knot. She looked at the sparking panel above her, tilted her head, and said, "Oh, that's just a loose bracket. Someone should tighten that before it drops on someone." Then she smiled at all of us crouched on the floor and said, "Hi, sorry, is this the right gate for the academy?" That was Meera Lindquist. That was the first time I saw a human being. For 3 days before her arrival, the academy had talked about nothing else. Humans were not common in our sector. Their homeworld was still under a strict observation quarantine, not because they were dangerous to us directly, but because everything about their planet was dangerous to everyone, including themselves. Instructors called it a Deathworld in hushed tones, the kind of word you use for a place, not a person. Radiation belts, unstable weather systems that could erase a city in an afternoon, gravity heavier than most species could comfortably stand in, predatory wildlife on every continent, in every ocean, in the soil itself. A world where, according to the survival files circulated to our science division, 90% of native life forms had killed something bigger than themselves at least once in their evolutionary history. And onto that world, evolution had placed exactly one species that built cities, wrote poetry, and somehow still went outside. So when the Interstellar Cultural Exchange Program announced that a single human student would be joining our academy for the coming term, half the campus expected something enormous. Armored, feral. My roommate, a quiet insectoid named Thessa, had spent 2 nights convinced we would be receiving something closer to a specimen than a classmate. Instead, we got Meera, 16 years old, apologizing to a wall panel for startling her. I was assigned as her orientation guide, mostly because I was one of the only students whose translator implant was calibrated for older human dialects, a leftover requirement from a linguistics elective I barely remembered choosing. I walked beside her down the main concourse, and I found myself watching her the way you watch weather that has not decided what it wants to do yet. She was clumsy, in a soft, almost endearing way. She tripped once over a raised seam in the flooring and apologized to the floor itself, which made 2 younger students laugh behind their hands. She marveled at the artificial gravity in the cafeteria, saying it felt lighter than home, and asked if that was normal or if something was wrong with the generators. When I told her it was standard academy gravity, she nodded slowly and said, "Okay, that explains why I keep almost floating out of my chair," like this was a mildly funny inconvenience, and not something worth mentioning twice. She was polite to everyone. She held doors. She thanked the cafeteria dispenser unit like it was a person, and when a small mechanical courier drone bumped into her ankle, she apologized to it too, out of what seemed to be pure habit. By the end of the first day, most of the academy had relaxed. The rumors softened into jokes. Someone in my dormitory wing said, only half joking, that the scariest thing about the human girl was how many times she said sorry in one afternoon. I wanted to relax too. I told myself I was relaxing. But there were small things, things that did not fit the picture everyone else was drawing. During the tour, we passed through the observation deck that looks out over the docking rings, where transport ships come and go in slow, careful arcs. A supply vessel misjudged its approach vector and clipped a guide beacon, sending a shower of harmless decorative sparks across the outer viewport. It was nothing, a cosmetic malfunction, the kind that happens weekly. Every other student on the deck flinched. Some yelped. One dropped their tablet. Meera did not flinch. She had already turned toward the sound before it fully registered. Body angled, weight shifted onto the balls of her feet, eyes tracking the spark trail like she was calculating where it would land and whether it would reach anyone standing near the glass. It lasted less than a second. Then she relaxed, laughed lightly and said, "Wow, that looked cooler than it probably was." I noticed, because I happened to be looking at her instead of the sparks. Nobody else saw it. Nobody else was watching her, the way I had already started to. Later, in the cafeteria, a serving tray slipped from another student's claws and clattered loudly against the floor. Half the room turned to look at the noise the way people do, a beat too late, already reacting instead of anticipating. Meera had turned before the tray hit the ground. Her eyes had gone to the exact spot it would land, then to the student who dropped it. Checking, I realized later, whether they were all right, before the sound had even finished echoing. I asked her about it, carefully, trying to sound curious rather than suspicious. "You move fast," I said, "faster than you seem to notice you're moving." She laughed and rubbed the back of her neck, a gesture I would come to recognize as embarrassment. "Sorry, is that weird here?" Back home, we kind of learn to watch things before you know you're watching them. My mom used to say I came out of the womb already checking the exits. She said it like a joke. She said everything like a joke. I did not know then that she was not exaggerating. Over dinner, while the rest of the table debated an upcoming combat theory exam, Meera mentioned, almost as an aside, that her hometown had 3 different native species that could be lethal within arm's reach, and that summer break usually included at least one storm warning serious enough to keep everyone indoors for a full day. She said it the way someone else might mention seasonal rain. Nobody at the table reacted much beyond polite surprise. Thessa asked if that meant humans had strong defenses built into their cities. "Some," Meera said, "but honestly, it's mostly just paying attention. You learn what a normal day sounds like, and you notice really fast when it doesn't sound normal anymore." She smiled, took a bite of whatever unfamiliar academy food had been assigned to her, and moved the conversation along to ask Thessa about her home planet instead, genuinely curious, genuinely warm. That was the pattern I would keep noticing over the following weeks. She deflected attention off herself as easily as she moved around a falling tray. She was kind, curious, a little awkward, endlessly polite. And underneath all of it, so quiet you could miss it if you were not already looking, she was reading every room she entered like a threat assessment she had run so many times it no longer felt like effort. I told myself I was imagining things. Everyone else on campus had already decided the scary stories about her homeworld were exaggerated, softened by distance and old data. The girl in front of us laughed at her own missteps and thanked mechanical courier drones. She could not possibly be what the survival files described. I wanted to believe that too, but that night, walking back to the dormitory wing after the tour ended, I passed the training level where 2 senior students, both from predator lineages, known across the sector for their combat instincts, were finishing an evening drill. They saw Meera in the hallway ahead of us, chatting easily with a group of younger students about nothing in particular, laughing at something one of them said. Both seniors went quiet. Not afraid, exactly. Alert. The kind of stillness a predator species falls into when something crosses its path that its instincts cannot quite classify, something that does not look dangerous, and does not smell dangerous, and yet still tightens the muscles along the back of the neck, for reasons the mind has not caught up to yet. They said nothing. They did not react outwardly at all, but I noticed, because by then I had started noticing everything about her, that they gave her the same wide, careful berth you give a live wire someone insists has been switched off. Meera did not seem to notice. Or if she did, she gave no sign of it, laughing again at whatever the younger students had said, waving goodnight to me as she peeled off toward her assigned quarters. I stood in the corridor after she left, replaying the day, the sparks she tracked before anyone heard them, the tray she turned toward before it hit the floor. The easy, joking way she described a childhood spent watching for threats that would have made most of my classmates' families relocate off-world. Everyone around me had met a smiling, clumsy, apologetic 16-year-old and decided the Deathworld stories were myths grown too large in the retelling. I was starting to think we had simply met her on a good day. The second week of the term began with a biology elective, and it was there that I first understood how differently Meera's mind worked from everyone else sharing that classroom. Our instructor, a calm and precise researcher named Professor Ulan, had brought in a containment case of small specimens from the Academy's teaching collection, harmless things meant to illustrate basic anatomy across several star systems. One of them, a soft, spotted creature with wide eyes, drew immediate delight from the room. Students leaned closer, cooing at it, reaching toward the glass. Meera leaned in too, but her eyes were not on its face. They moved down its legs, along the faint ridges on its back, to the small glands near its tail. "That's a nice one," she said, mostly to herself. "Back home we'd call that coloring a warning pattern. Bright, contrasting, easy to spot, usually means something in it doesn't agree with your bloodstream." Professor Ulanen raised an eyebrow, clearly pleased. "Correct. Its glandular secretion is mildly toxic if ingested, though harmless to the touch. Well observed, Miss Lindquist. Have you studied comparative toxicology before?" "Not really," Meera said, shrugging. "You just get an eye for it after a while. Bright colors, sudden stillness, anything that looks calm but isn't moving away from you when it should be. Those are the ones you slow down for." A few students laughed, assuming she was describing some minor childhood hobby, collecting insects in a garden, perhaps. I did not laugh. I had already begun writing down the small, strange details of her behavior in a private file on my datapad, the way you might record unusual weather patterns before you understand what they are building toward. Later that same week, our class was assigned a joint physical assessment, an easy, standard fitness evaluation meant to establish baseline data for every visiting exchange student. It included simple things: a timed run, a balance test, a reaction drill using a soft projectile launcher that fired foam markers at random intervals so instructors could measure reflex speed. Most students did well within expected ranges for their species. Thessa's reflexes were excellent, her insectoid nervous system built for speed. Two Dreyloth twins, from a lineage of natural climbers, outperformed the balance test easily. Then it was Meera's turn. The foam markers launched from 3 different angles, no visible pattern, meant to be unpredictable enough that no student could anticipate them. I watched her stand loosely at the center of the drill floor, almost too relaxed, hands at her sides, expression easy. The first marker fired. She caught it out of the air without seeming to look for it, fingers closing around it a fraction of a second after it left the launcher, long before it would have struck her. The second fired from a different angle entirely, faster, and she turned her body just enough to let it pass harmlessly by her shoulder, as though she had already known which direction to lean before the launcher chose it. The room went quiet. The instructor running the drill checked the readout twice, muttering something about recalibrating the sensor, assuming a malfunction. Meera laughed it off immediately, saying something about lucky guessing, rubbing the back of her neck the way she always did when attention landed on her. The other students accepted the explanation easily. Malfunctioning equipment was more comfortable to believe than the alternative. I stayed after the session ended, ostensibly to help reset the drill floor, actually to ask the instructor quietly if the sensor truly had glitched. "No," she admitted, lowering her voice. "The launcher fired correctly. Her reaction time, registered faster than our scale, is built to measure accurately. I'll need to recalibrate the equipment for a wider range if she participates again." I carried that piece of information with me for days, turning it over, trying to reconcile it with the girl who thanked courier drones and apologized to floors. The truth is, the two were not in conflict at all. That was what I had not yet understood. A few days later, during a free period, a group of us gathered in the courtyard between lecture halls, an open green space beneath the artificial sky dome that mimicked a soft afternoon light cycle. Someone had brought up the subject of home planets, the way exchange students often did when getting to know each other, comparing what an ordinary day looked like across different worlds. Thessa described her hive city's methods of climate regulation. One of the Draloth twins talked about mountain migrations his family made twice a year. When it came to Meera's turn, she leaned back against the courtyard railing, thinking for a moment, the way people do when they are trying to decide how much detail is too much. "Okay, so where I'm from," she said, "we've got about, I don't know, thousands of species that could probably hurt you badly if you weren't paying attention. Some in the water, some in the trees, some just quietly sitting in tall grass waiting for you to not notice them. My grandmother used to keep a chart on the kitchen wall of which spiders in our region were dangerous and which ones just looked scary. I had it memorized before I could read properly." Everyone laughed, assuming exaggeration, the kind of storytelling every species does about home. "There's also weather," she continued, encouraged by the laughter, clearly enjoying herself now. "Where I grew up, we get storms that can flatten a house if you're not built for them. When I was 7, we had one bad enough that school got canceled for 2 days, and half our street lost roof tiles. I remember thinking it was kind of exciting, honestly, watching the trees bend that far without snapping." "That sounds terrifying," Thessa said, half laughing, half serious. "It's normal, though," Meera said. And there it was again, that easy shrug, that casual tone, describing conditions that would have emptied entire districts of my homeworld in a season. You just learn the signs. Certain smell in the air before a bad one hits. Certain quiet before something's about to happen. You stop thinking about it after a while, it's just Tuesday. A younger student, clearly trying to sound clever, asked if that meant humans were simply built tougher than the rest of us, more resistant to harm. Meera actually looked thoughtful at that, tilting her head. "No, I don't think we're tougher, really. I think we just got really good at knowing when to be careful and when it's safe to relax. Everything on my planet that could hurt you taught you to notice patterns fast, or it didn't leave you around long enough to teach anyone else." She said this lightly, almost fondly, like she was describing a strict but ultimately fair teacher. I sat with that sentence long after the conversation moved elsewhere. Everything that could hurt you taught you to notice patterns fast, or it didn't leave you around long enough to teach anyone else. She had said it with a smile. She always said everything with a smile. That evening, walking back from the courtyard, we passed the Academy's small memorial garden, a quiet space dedicated to notable alumni and researchers lost during expeditions across the sector. Meera slowed as we passed it, reading the names etched into the low stone markers, her expression softening into something gentler and sadder than I had seen from her yet. "Do you lose a lot of people out here?" she asked. "Exploring, I mean, between planets." "Occasionally," I said. "Space itself is unforgiving in its own ways. Equipment failures, unstable jumps, unmapped hazards." She nodded slowly, tracing one of the names with her eyes rather than her fingers, a kind of respectful distance. "We lose people at home, too. Every year, actually. Storms, animals, accidents, the ocean deciding it doesn't want you that day." She paused. "I think that's probably why humans got sent to the sector so late, right? Because our whole planet looks like one long list of ways to lose people." I did not know how to answer that honestly, so I said nothing, and she did not seem to expect an answer. She simply exhaled, gave the memorial one last look, and said, quieter than before, "It's strange, being somewhere calm enough that a falling spark counts as an event." That was the moment I understood, with a small, cold certainty settling into my chest, that everything relaxed and joking about her was not a mask hiding something dangerous underneath. It was closer to armor, built by a childhood that never had the luxury of not being alert, worn so long and so well that it had become simply who she was. She was not pretending to be harmless. She had learned, from birth, exactly how to survive being surrounded by things that were not. The following afternoon, our class received notice of the upcoming combat readiness simulation scheduled for the following week, a standard exercise required of every exchange student. meant to establish baseline preparedness in a fully controlled virtual environment. The notice described it as routine, low risk, calibrated individually for each species' physiology. I remember reading that word, calibrated, and thinking of the reaction drill instructor quietly telling me her equipment could not measure Meera accurately. I did not know yet how badly that calibration was about to fail. The simulation deck sat 3 levels below the main academy, a wide circular chamber lined with soft plating that could reshape itself into any terrain the exercise required. On the day of the readiness test, a dozen of us gathered along the observation gallery above it, watching through reinforced glass while, one at a time, students entered the chamber to complete their individually calibrated scenario. The exercise was simple in design. Sensors read a student's physical and neurological baseline, then generated a controlled scenario matched to their species, difficult enough to test genuine reflexes and decision-making, safe enough that nothing in the simulation could cause lasting harm. Thessa went first, navigating a simulated hive collapse with practiced ease. One of the Dreyloth twins handled a simulated rock slide, using his natural climbing instincts to reach safe ground well within the allotted time. Every scenario looked tense from the gallery, but never truly dangerous. That was the entire purpose of the exercise. When Meera's turn came, the technician running the deck, a methodical, unhurried man named Callum, pulled up her baseline data and began entering it into the calibration system. I was standing close enough to the control terminal to see his expression change. "That can't be right," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else, and ran the baseline scan again. Beside him, another technician glanced over his shoulder at the readout and frowned. "Reflex thresholds outside our normal scaling. Try recalibrating from the raw sensor data instead of the standard template." Callum did, adjusting settings, running the scan a 3rd time. Each attempt returned numbers that, according to the murmured conversation I overheard, sat far outside anything the system had been designed to translate into a matched difficulty scenario. The Academy's simulation software had been built and refined over generations, calibrated against the baseline data of dozens of known species. It had never needed to account for a species whose everyday threshold for danger sat, by comparison, somewhere near the extreme end of its own scale. "Just use the closest matched template," the second technician finally said, glancing at the growing line of students still waiting their turn. "We're behind schedule. Pull the nearest predator species baseline and adjust down slightly. It'll be close enough for a training exercise." Callum hesitated, then nodded, tired, distracted, trusting the system the way people trust tools they have used 1,000 times without failure. He entered the adjusted parameters and cleared Meera to begin. I did not understand, standing in that gallery, exactly what mistake had just been made. I only understood, much later, that the calibration meant to create a moderately challenging scenario for an exchange student had instead generated something built from extreme survival parameters, a setting the system's own documentation listed as reserved for advanced training exercises involving fully prepared combat cadets, not first-term exchange students undergoing a routine assessment. Meera walked into the chamber without hesitation, offering a small wave up toward the gallery before the deck sealed behind her. The terrain shifted almost immediately, plating reshaping into uneven rocky ground beneath a simulated dim sky, environmental systems layering in the scent and sound of an unstable atmosphere. Warning lights along the control panel flickered from green to amber, a status indicator meaning the scenario's difficulty had registered as higher than intended, a signal that should have prompted an immediate pause for review. Nobody paused it. Through the observation glass, I watched Meera take in her surroundings, not with alarm, but with quiet, immediate assessment, the same calm scanning I had seen her use on the docking hall sparks and the falling tray, except now it moved across her entire body at once, weight shifting low, eyes tracking terrain, breathing slowing into something deliberate. The scenario's first hazard activated, a section of simulated ground giving way beneath a projected structural collapse, meant to test reaction under sudden instability. Meera was already moving before the plating finished shifting, covering the distance to stable ground in a controlled sprint that looked, from the gallery, almost lazy in its economy. No wasted motion, no panic, simply calculation carried out at speed. "That's not standard collapse timing," Callum muttered, checking his readout again, brow furrowed. "The system's escalating." It was. I watched the amber warning light shift toward a deeper shade, the simulation adjusting itself upward in response to how easily its first challenge had been handled, an automated feature meant to keep trained combat cadets appropriately tested, now reacting to a 16-year-old exchange student the same way it would react to a seasoned recruit. The environment reshaped again, introducing simulated hazards meant to test coordinated threat response, multiple points of danger activating at overlapping intervals rather than one at a time. From the gallery, several students gasped audibly, watching projected instability spread rapidly across the simulated terrain. Meera moved through it with an expression that, if anything, looked focused rather than afraid. The easy, joking softness I had come to know from her, replaced by something quieter and far older, a calm that did not need to think about what to do, because the decisions had already been made somewhere beneath conscious thought. She was not fighting the simulation, exactly. She was reading it, the way I imagined she read storms before they broke, and quiet before something happened, adjusting a half-step here, a shift in balance there, always slightly ahead of whatever the system generated next. "Pull her out," someone in the gallery finally said, voice tight. "This isn't calibrated right, this is dangerous." Callum's hand hovered over the emergency recall control, hesitating, watching the readout that should have shown rising stress indicators, elevated heart rate, the physiological signs of a student in genuine danger. Her readings were steady. Not calm in the way someone forces themselves to appear calm under pressure, steady in a way that suggested her body had simply not registered the scenario as requiring anything beyond ordinary attention. Her heart rate had risen only slightly above resting. Her breathing remained even. The system's own biometric monitors, built to flag genuine distress, found nothing alarming to flag. The simulation escalated a third time, environmental systems layering in a final combined hazard sequence meant to push a fully trained cadet to the edge of their capability. Structural instability, simulated pressure changes, a moving obstacle field requiring constant, split-second recalibration of position. I watched Meera navigate all of it at once, weaving through the shifting terrain with an economy of motion that made the entire exercise look impossibly, almost gentle, like watching someone walk calmly through a room full of falling objects they had already mapped before the first one left the ceiling. She reached the designated endpoint of the scenario nearly a full minute before the exercise's allotted time expired. The chamber lights returned to their standard configuration, the plating reshaped back into a neutral floor. Meera stood at the center of it, slightly out of breath, brushing simulated dust from her sleeve, looking up toward the gallery with an expression of mild, genuine curiosity rather than relief. "Is that it?" she called up, voice carrying clearly through the deck's audio pickup. That felt a little easier than I expected, honestly. Is there a harder setting, or was that the actual test? Nobody in the gallery answered immediately. I remember the silence in that room more vividly than almost anything else from that term. A dozen students, several instructors, 2 technicians, all staring down at a 16-year-old girl standing calmly in the center of a chamber that had, by every measure the system possessed, just subjected her to conditions designed for advanced combat cadets. Conditions that would have required careful, exhausting effort from most of the trained professionals on this station. She had asked if there was a harder setting. Callum finally cleared his throat and told her the exercise was complete, that she could exit the deck, his voice carefully neutral in a way that suggested years of professional training were the only thing keeping it steady. Meera nodded, thanked him, and made her way toward the exit, pausing briefly to ask a nearby technician if the flickering warning light meant something was wrong with the equipment, apparently having noticed the amber escalation indicator after all, without ever having treated it as cause for concern. The gallery emptied out slowly after that, students filing away in small clusters, murmuring to each other in tones that had shifted from casual curiosity into something quieter and more careful. I stayed behind, watching Callum and the second technician review the session data together, their voices low. The escalation parameters shouldn't have been able to reach that tier, the second technician was saying, scrolling through readouts. That's restricted to advanced certification testing. How did baseline calibration push this far past a standard exchange assessment? Because her baseline wasn't standard, Callum said quietly. We adjusted a predator template down to try to match her numbers. It wasn't enough. Her actual resting threshold sits closer to what we'd expect from trained personnel who've already survived hostile field conditions, not from an untrained 16-year-old on her first term away from home. She's not trained personnel. No, Callum agreed, and something in his voice made me go very still where I stood near the gallery railing. She's just from a planet where this was apparently normal enough that her body never learned to treat it as anything else. I thought of her voice in the courtyard days earlier, easy and warm, saying that everything on her planet that could hurt you taught you to notice patterns fast, or it did not leave you around long enough to teach anyone else. I thought of the memorial garden, her quiet question about how many people the sector lost between the stars, and her own answer about her own world, the ocean deciding it did not want you that day. I found her later that evening in the courtyard, sitting alone beneath the artificial sky dome, watching the projected stars cycle slowly overhead. She looked smaller there than she had in the simulation chamber, ordinary again, tracing patterns in the grass with one finger, lost in thought. You did well today, I said, sitting carefully beside her. She smiled, that same easy, slightly embarrassed smile I had come to associate with her. It didn't feel like much, honestly. I kept waiting for it to actually get hard. She paused, glancing at me sideways. People looked kind of freaked out afterward. Did I do something wrong? No, I said carefully. I think people simply did not expect what they saw. She considered that for a long moment, tracing another slow pattern in the grass. I never really thought about it as anything special, she said quietly. It's just, back home, you learn early that the world isn't going to slow down and wait for you to be ready. So you get ready instead, as fast as you can, or you don't get a lot of chances to try again. She shrugged, a small, tired gesture. I guess I forgot that's not how it works everywhere else. I did not have an answer for her. I only sat there beside her under the false, gentle stars, thinking about amber warning lights that should have meant danger, and a heart rate that never rose past ordinary, and a girl who had walked calmly through conditions built for trained cadets and asked, afterward, with real and simple curiosity, whether there was something harder. I understood, finally and completely, that the Deathworld stories the sector told about her homeworld were not exaggerations softened by distance. If anything, I suspected, they had been softened the other way. News of the simulation incident spread across the academy faster than anything official ever could. By the following morning, half the students I passed in the corridors were whispering about the human girl who had walked through an advanced cadet scenario without her heart rate ever properly rising. The stories grew with each retelling, the way stories do, until by midday some students were claiming she had broken the equipment on purpose, or that the academy was quietly running secret tests on her without her knowledge. None of it was true, as far as I could tell. Meera herself seemed genuinely bewildered by the sudden attention, more embarrassed than anything, waving off questions in the cafeteria line with the same easy shrug she used for everything, insisting she had simply gotten lucky with the timing. Not everyone found that answer satisfying. There was a senior student named Corvin Vask, from a proud lineage of trained combat instructors, who had built much of his reputation on the Academy's official readiness rankings. He was skilled, disciplined, and, I had noticed over the term, deeply uncomfortable with anything that threatened to unsettle the established order of who ranked where. The story of an untrained exchange student outperforming calibration built for advanced cadets did not sit well with him at all. He cornered Meera and me near the training level 3 days after the incident, flanked by 2 of his usual companions, his tone friendly on the surface in the particular way that made it clear it was not friendly underneath. "I heard the deck's equipment glitched during your session," he said to Meera, arms crossed. "Must be strange, getting credit for a malfunction." "Pretty sure it wasn't a malfunction," Meera said easily. "But honestly, I don't know enough about the equipment to argue with you." "Convenient," Corvin said, glancing at his companions with a small, knowing smile. "There's an unmonitored section on the lower maintenance level, past the old hydroponics bay. No sensors, no calibration errors to blame, no simulation to argue about. Real conditions. If your reflexes are half of what the story says, that shouldn't be a problem for you." I felt something cold settle in my chest immediately. The lower maintenance level was off limits to students for good reason, a section of the station still being retrofitted, with unstable flooring in places and containment systems for the Academy's botanical research program that had not yet been fully secured for casual access. It was not a place for a challenge. It was not a place for anyone without proper clearance. "That area's restricted," I said quickly. "This isn't a good idea." "Nobody's forcing her," Corvin said smoothly, not looking away from Meera, "unless the stories were exaggerated after all." I expected Meera to decline. I hoped she would decline. Instead, she tilted her head, studying Corvin for a long moment with an expression I had not seen from her before, something quieter and more assessing than her usual easy warmth. "All right," she said finally, "but if anyone gets hurt because of this, that's on you, not me." I tried to talk her out of it on the walk down, and she listened patiently, nodding along, but did not change her mind. "If I don't go," she said quietly, "he keeps pushing, and eventually he pushes someone who can't handle it the way I can. Better it's me." Corvin's group led us down through a maintenance corridor that smelled faintly of recycled air and old-growth medium, past warning placards clearly marking the section as restricted, until we reached the edge of the station's old hydroponics bay, a wide, dim space filled with overgrown rows of research vegetation that had been left to grow unchecked while the section awaited proper decommissioning. Several of the plants here were part of a xenobotany research program studying aggressive, fast-growing specimens gathered from unstable frontier worlds, kept in this sealed section specifically because their growth patterns and defensive responses were not yet fully understood. I did not know that last detail until it was already too late to matter. Corvin's plan, as far as I understood it, was simple and small-minded, meant only to embarrass Meera by having her navigate the uneven, cluttered walkways of the bay under a short time limit, nothing more dangerous than a dare between overconfident students. He had not accounted for the research containment door at the far end of the bay, old and improperly sealed after the last maintenance cycle, or for what waited quietly behind it. We heard it before we saw it, a low, rhythmic rustling from deep among the overgrown rows, followed by a soft, wet clicking sound that raised the fine hairs along my arms without my understanding why. "That's not supposed to be active," one of Corvin's companions said, voice suddenly much less confident. The containment door at the far end of the bay had failed sometime during the section's long neglect, and something from the research collection, a specimen gathered from a frontier world specifically because of its unpredictable and aggressive growth behavior, had been slowly spreading unchecked through the overgrown rows for longer than anyone realized. It was not an animal, not exactly, closer to a mobile, reactive plant structure that responded to movement and vibration by launching thin, barbed tendrils meant to snare and subdue small prey animals on its homeworld, tendrils that carried a numbing toxin strong enough to immobilize anything larger than expected if enough of them made contact at once. None of us understood any of that yet. We only understood the sound was getting closer, and the narrow walkway behind us had partially collapsed under old, unmaintained flooring, cutting off our easy route back the way we had come. Corvin's easy confidence vanished entirely. His companions backed toward the nearest wall, eyes wide, one of them fumbling uselessly with a communicator that had no signal this deep in the maintenance section. Meera's entire posture changed in an instant. The soft, joking warmth was simply gone, replaced by the same quiet, focused calm I had glimpsed in the simulation chamber, except now there was no controlled system generating the danger, no safety measures waiting to catch a mistake. Her eyes moved across the bay methodically, tracking the rustling movement through the overgrown rows, the narrow, unstable walkways, the position of every student frozen in place around her. "Nobody move fast," she said, voice low and steady, the words landing with an authority that made even Corvin, twice her size and years her senior, go still and listen. Moving fast is what triggers it. Just breathe normal, stay where you are. "What is that thing?" one of the younger companions whispered, voice shaking. "Don't know exactly," Meera said, still scanning, still calm, but the way it's moving tells me plenty. Slow, patient, reacting to vibration more than sight probably. That's a hunting pattern I've seen versions of before, just, with different creatures. She said this with an edge of something almost like grim familiarity, the tone of someone recognizing an old, unwelcome acquaintance, rather than encountering something entirely new. She moved then, slowly, deliberately, placing herself between the frozen group of students and the source of the rustling, closing the distance to the failed containment door instead of retreating from it. I wanted to call out for her to stop, to come back toward us, but something in her posture told me interrupting her now would be the worst possible thing I could do. The overgrown rows shifted, and thin, pale tendrils lashed outward toward her with startling speed, faster than anything I expected such a stationary-looking structure to be capable of. Meera was already moving before they closed the distance, stepping sideways with the same economical, unhurried precision I had watched in the simulation chamber, letting the tendrils pass just short of her, using the motion to reach the edge of the failed containment door itself. She grabbed the heavy manual override lever built into the old mechanism, the kind meant for emergencies exactly like this one, and threw her weight into it. The door groaned, resisted, then finally shuttered closed, sealing the specimen back into its original containment section with a heavy, final clang that echoed through the bay. Silence followed, broken only by everyone's ragged breathing, including, finally, her own. She turned back toward us, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw something like real exhaustion flicker across her face, quickly smoothed back into that familiar, easy expression. "Everyone okay?" she asked, scanning each of us in turn, checking for injuries with quick, practiced eyes before anything else. Corvin stared at her, pale, his earlier confidence entirely gone. "How did you know how to close that?" he asked quietly. "You've never even been down here before." "I didn't know that specific mechanism," Meera admitted, "but most emergency systems work on similar logic. Wherever you go, you just look for the thing built to fail safely, and you use it." She exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of her neck in that same familiar gesture, though it looked heavier now, more tired than embarrassed. "Also, for what it's worth, that thing back there wasn't trying to hurt anyone out of malice. It was just doing what it's built to do. Doesn't make it any less dangerous, but it's not the villain here." Nobody answered her. Corvin's companions were already helping each other toward the exit, shaken and silent. Corvin himself lingered a moment longer, looking at Meera with an expression I could not quite name, something between shame and a kind of dawning, uncomfortable respect. "I'm sorry," he finally said, quiet enough that I almost missed it. "I didn't think there was actually anything down here." "I know," Meera said, not unkindly. "Nobody ever really thinks the dangerous part is going to show up. That's usually when it does." She offered him a small, tired smile, the anger I expected from her simply absent, replaced instead by something almost gentle, almost forgiving. We made our way back up through the maintenance corridors in near total silence, and it was only once we reached the main concourse, back among the ordinary sounds of the academy, that I allowed myself to fully understand what I had just watched. A group of trained, confident students, myself included, had frozen entirely in the face of real danger. A 16-year-old exchange student, untrained by any formal academy standard, had moved calmly to the front of that danger and ended it before anyone else had even finished registering what was happening. I thought of the survival files that spoke of her homeworld in hushed, careful tones, calling it a death world the way you might describe a place rather than acknowledge the people who somehow, impossibly, thrived there anyway. I finally understood, walking beside her in exhausted silence, exactly why those files existed and exactly why they had never come close to telling the whole story. The Academy handled the aftermath quietly, in the careful, procedural way institutions handle anything that embarrasses them. The failed containment door was repaired within a day. The specimen was relocated to a properly secured research wing under stricter protocols. Corvin and his companions received disciplinary notices for entering a restricted section without authorization, though Corvin, to his credit, made a point of telling the review panel plainly that the fault was entirely his own, that Meera had done nothing but keep everyone else safe from a situation he had created. I did not know, until later, that he had also gone to find her privately afterward, away from any official proceedings, to thank her properly and apologize again in a way that did not require an audience. Meera told me about it herself, a little sheepishly, saying only that he had turned out to be decent once the posturing was stripped away, and that everyone deserved a chance to be better than their worst afternoon. That was, I was beginning to understand, simply how she moved through the world. Not naive, never naive, but generous in a way that did not require her to pretend the danger around her was smaller than it was. The story of what happened in the old hydroponics bay spread across the Academy nearly as fast as the simulation incident had, but it landed differently this time. There was less breathless exaggeration in the retelling, less of the nervous, half-joking fear that had followed her during her first days on campus. Students who passed her in the corridors now offered small nods of genuine respect rather than curious, wary glances. The Predator lineage seniors who had once given her careful, instinctive distance in the hallway began, slowly, to include her in their training discussions, treating her less like an anomaly to be quietly monitored and more like someone whose instincts, however differently developed, were worth understanding. Meera, for her part, seemed almost uncomfortable with the shift. She still apologized when she bumped into someone in a crowded corridor. She still thanked the courier drones. She still tripped over the same raised seam in the flooring near the East Concourse at least once a week, laughing at herself every time as though it were the first. I asked her, one evening in the courtyard beneath the artificial stars, whether she had ever been afraid, back in that overgrown bay, facing something none of us fully understood. She thought about the question seriously before answering, which I had come to recognize as one of her most consistent qualities, never dismissing a genuine question with an easy joke, even when the joke would have been simpler. A little, she admitted. Not the kind of afraid that makes you freeze, though. More like background noise. You feel it, you just don't let it decide what you do next. She pulled her knees up, resting her chin on them, watching the projected stars cycle slowly overhead. I think that's the actual difference, honestly. Everybody feels scared sometimes. It's just, where I'm from, you learn really early that being scared and being able to act are two completely separate things. You don't wait for one to go away before you do the other. That sounds like an exhausting way to grow up, I said quietly. She considered that too, longer than I expected. Maybe, she said, but it also means I never really had the luxury of falling apart when things got bad. There wasn't time. You just learned to keep your hands steady and figure it out, because if you didn't, nobody else necessarily would either. She glanced at me sideways, something softer in her expression now. It's actually really nice, being somewhere like this, where a spark from a docking clamp is the scariest thing that happens all week. I didn't realize how much I'd noticed that difference until I got here. I thought about the sector's quiet, careful files on her homeworld. The term Deathworld used the way you might describe a hazard rather than a place people called home. I thought about how the entire academy, myself included, had spent weeks searching her behavior for signs of danger, watching for claws beneath the smile, waiting for the moment the gentle, apologetic exchange student would reveal something monstrous underneath. We had been asking the wrong question the entire time. She was never hiding something dangerous behind her kindness. The kindness and the danger had never been separate things to begin with. Her calm in the face of real threat was not a mask over something feral. It was simply what an ordinary, decent person looked like after growing up somewhere that demanded competence as the price of survival, and had, against every reasonable expectation, produced someone who came out the other side gentle anyway. That, I realized, was the part the sector's careful, clinical files could never properly capture. Not the storms, not the venomous creatures, not the radiation belts or the unstable seas. The truly remarkable thing about her homeworld was not how dangerous it was. It was that it had produced someone like her, regardless. Weeks passed. The term settled into its familiar rhythm, and Meera became, in the ordinary sense that mattered most, simply another student at Vale Orbital Academy, one who happened to laugh a little louder than most, apologize a little more than necessary, and occasionally demonstrate reflexes that made visiting instructors quietly request additional baseline data for their own research. Near the end of the term, during a routine equipment inspection, a support strut on the observation deck failed unexpectedly, sending a section of unsecured paneling crashing down toward a group of younger students who had gathered near the viewport, too absorbed in the view of a passing supply convoy to notice the warning groan of metal above them. I was there. I saw the panel begin to fall. I saw the exact half-second where every one of us older students simply froze, the way people do when the moment arrives faster than the mind expects. Meera did not freeze. She moved before any of us fully understood what was happening, closing the distance in 3 quick, controlled strides, sweeping the nearest 2 younger students clear, with practiced, careful hands, guiding the others back with a calm, steady voice that cut cleanly through the sudden panic. The panel struck the deck a moment later, loud and heavy, but harmless, everyone already clear. The younger students clustered around her afterward, shaken but unharmed, thanking her in a chorus of relieved voices. Meera waved it off with her familiar, easy smile, telling them it was nothing, that she had just been standing closest, that anyone would have done the same. Nobody in that observation deck believed that last part, not anymore. But nobody corrected her either. They simply thanked her again, and she laughed, embarrassed, and asked if everyone was really all right, checking each of them over herself before letting the moment go. I watched her from a short distance, the same way I had watched her on her very first day, stepping off that transport into a hall full of frightened students crouched low beneath a failing panel, humming to herself, entirely unbothered. She caught me looking and grinned, that same wide, warm, apologetic grin that had convinced an entire academy she was harmless. I understood now, in a way I had not understood that first day, exactly what was behind that grin. Not a predator, hiding beneath gentleness, waiting for a reason to show itself. Something rarer than that, and in its own way, far more remarkable. A girl who had grown up somewhere the universe had never once made easy for her, who had learned to move calmly through danger, because the alternative had simply never been available to her, and who had come through all of it still smiling, still apologizing to walls, still kind to courier drones, still genuinely, unshakably good. The sector called her homeworld a death world, and perhaps, by every careful measure in every cautious file, it was. But watching her laugh with the younger students in that observation deck, brushing dust from her sleeve, already turning the conversation away from herself and toward whether anyone needed to see the healer for a scraped elbow, I found myself thinking that the sector had never once bothered to ask the more interesting question. Not what kind of world could produce something so dangerous. What kind of world could go through everything hers had and still, somehow, produce someone this kind? I never did find a satisfying answer to that question. I am not sure one exists, tidy enough to fit into any file. I only know that whenever I picture her now, it is never the memory of her moving through that overgrown bay with calm, terrifying precision, or standing untouched at the center of a simulation built for cadets far older than her. It is her, ordinary and warm, apologizing to a wall panel on her very first day, smiling at a hallway full of strangers who had no idea, not yet, exactly what they were looking at.